Budaya. Good evening. Welcome to the Buddha Dharma TV. I am Sherry Chandra from Jakarta, Indonesia. Today, we present to you how Theravada Buddhist monks pay homage to the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the order of the Sangha at the start of the overnight Buddhist chanting. Here is how monks in Sri Lanka pay their pre-chanting veneration to the Triple Gems. It was conducted by the Venerable Watala Silaratana. It was so peaceful chanting indeed. Now, here is Venerable Dr. Bhikkhu Bodhi of the United States to give his fourth lecture on an introduction to Buddhism.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the class number 4 in the series called The Path to Inner Freedom, an Introduction to the Teachings of the Buddha. Okay, with today's class, we come to one of the most difficult subjects in the Buddha's teaching. This will be the nature of the 5 aggregates and the 3 marks or the 3 characteristics of existence. And basically, as we'll see, that these 2 topics are interwoven, interdependent. Okay, in Buddhism, the primary emphasis is placed upon understanding. So the Buddha says that wisdom or insight is the method or the means for achieving ultimate freedom, ultimate liberation. And what one has to understand with wisdom, we say in a general way, is the true nature of existence. And to understand the true nature of existence is not understanding things in the outer world objectively, the way a scientist will understand things, but it means understanding the nature of one's own existence. And the great problem, according to Buddhism, the great problem of human existence is that we grasp upon our own existence, our own being, as having the nature of a self, a kind of substantial entity. And so we identify ourselves as being a self, and we take our body and mind as being mine, or what I truly am. And this clinging to this body and mind, that is the source, according to the Buddha, of suffering. So that misapprehension or misunderstanding of the nature of body and mind, this, we could say, is what is meant, what Buddhism means by ignorance, what the Buddha calls avijja. It means not seeing and understanding things as they really are. And when that understanding is absent, when it's lacking, that gives rise to clinging to the body, clinging to the mind, and then the identification of the body and mind as being an truly existing I, or as belonging to me. And so we always have this kind of, we call it an illusion of a self or of some kind of substantial ego or I lurking in the background of our experience. So it seems that everything is happening to me, or that I am doing this, doing that. And the sense of I, me, and taking things to be mine, all of this, according to the Buddha, is the different forms of grasping or clinging, which are grounded in that ignorance, which arise from that ignorance. And so the Buddha says that in order to get free from that clinging and grasping, which is the root of suffering, one has to understand the nature of one's own existence, sort of to penetrate through this obstacles or delusions of I, mine, me, myself, and to see things as they really are. And so this means to understand experience in terms of the five aggregates, to understand our own being in terms of the five aggregates, and then to see into the actual characteristics or the real nature of these five aggregates. Okay, when I use this word aggregate, you see, the word aggregate has become something, there's a kind of expression that's come up, it's called, let me see, hybrid Buddhist English. Okay, and so there's the Pali word that I'm rendering by aggregate is the word khanda. The word khanda, in its original usage, means something like a bundle or a stack of things. Like a bundle of firewood would be called a khanda, or a log of wood would be called a khanda. And so the Buddha took this word of common usage and he used it as the basis for a classification of experience into the basic constituents of experience. And so the Buddha used sort of the scalpel of his insight to look into the nature of experience, and he dissected experience into these five constituents, five components. And so taken together, these are what we call the five aggregates. And each aggregate is actually a broad, we could say it's a broad bag into which many constituents, many subordinate components could be included. And now, you see, when we take the person, a human being, the person appears to us to be a solid, unified whole, to have some kind of solid, substantial existence. But the Buddha dissects experience into these 5 aggregates in order to show that this appearance of solidity or substantial unity is just an appearance. It's just let's call it a deluding appearance. But when we investigate our experience and see what is actually present, when we put aside these concepts and these overarching ideas, and we just attend very closely, and particularly through the light of meditative experience, to what is actually occurring at any particular moment, what is actually present, the Buddha says that one finds that there is this conglomeration of things functioning together in unison. But when we look into that conglomeration analytically, we see that there are 5 kinds of constituents which are woven together to make up the fabric of experience. So these 5 types of components are what are called the 5 aggregates. So the 5 aggregates, first I'll just take them generally, then we'll go into each one. The coarsest, the most obvious, actually the sequence, it seems, goes from the coarsest to the subtlest. The coarsest is the aggregate of material form, especially this physical body. And so this physical body or form is the basis for all experience. It's sort of the necessary instrument for all experience. The other 4 aggregates pertain to the mental side of experience. So here we have feeling, perception, then a big category which is called volitional activities or mental formations. And then the 5th aggregate is the aggregate of consciousness. And so when we look into the nature of the person, sort of with this investigative mind, trying to see what is taking place at any particular moment of experience, we see that there is this physical body equipped with its sense faculties through which we experience objects in the world around us, as well as the inner workings of our own minds. And then there will be some kind of feeling present, pleasant, painful, neutral feeling, some kind of perception, a whole bundle or mass of various mental activities. And then there'll be the awareness of what is taking place, which is consciousness. And so according to the Buddha's teaching, what we speak of as the person, the individual, the human being, this is useful as, we could say, a conceptual designation, a convenient term of reference. And so we could say at the empirical level, the person exists. Like, I'm one person, I'm different from Venerable Mangala. I have my body, he has his body. I have my experience, my history, my biography. If somebody is writing my biography, they don't write Venerable Mangala's biography, though it might be more interesting. So at the empirical level, we have different persons, and we could say that at this empirical level, people exist, even you could say the self exists, just as a convenient designation. But when we try to find out, as I said, what concretely exists, we see what is actually occurring that makes up the fabric of experience. There we find one or another of these five aggregates, or actually we find an assemblage of these five aggregates. Okay, so this is the person. And the person thinks, I, me. He's holding a cell phone and car keys. So those are things that taken to be mine. Takes I and me to refer to himself. And if he's a little bit philosophical, he'll start wondering, maybe, what is myself? And maybe he'll come up with different views about the way philosophers do. What is myself? Am I just the material body? Is there some kind of soul or spirit within me that's my true self? Somebody who's something which is sort of looking out through the eyes, listening through the ears, that always remains the same. Okay, so this is what we have in sort of the way the mind ordinarily functions. And so we could say that these designations, according to the Buddha, are useful as conventional designations. Or we could say means of communication. But what is really here, actually here, is some kind of, let's say, assemblage of the five aggregates. Is my writing readable? Okay, good. Okay, so let us now look more closely at these five aggregates to see what each one actually involves. And they're explained, I think, quite well also in that book called The Fundamentals of Buddhism by Peter della Santina. Okay, so the first aggregate, sort of the coarsest, the most obvious, is the aggregate of material form. And in the suttas, or the discourses, the aggregate of form is said to consist of, firstly, of the four primary elements. So these elements are designated by the ancient Indian terms, the earth element, the water element, the fire element, and the air element. But the way the Buddhist texts interpret these elements, they actually stand for, I would call this like, four different modes in which matter occurs. Okay, the earth element is the aspect of solidity or resistance, sort of resistance to pressure. The water element is said to be the property of, you could say, of liquidity. So the liquid constituents of the body. In the liquid constituents of the body, the water element is most prominent. And the water element, it's said, has the function of binding the particles of matter together. The fire element is the element of heat, that we can experience in the body. That the body has a constant temperature, a normal temperature, roughly 98 degrees. We experience the heat element on a hot day from the sun. So this is the fire element. And then the air element has the property of motion or movement. So then at the subtlest level, it's the aspect of vibration in material particles. So those are considered like the basic constituents of matter. And then out of those basic constituents come a whole variety of derived material phenomena. And the most important of these derived material phenomena are the physical sense faculties. So we have the eye with its capacity for serving as the base for vision. The ear faculty serves as the base for hearing. The nose serves as the base for smelling. The tongue, certain nerves in the tongue for tasting. And then the body faculty, a certain capacity for feeling tactile sensations, spread throughout the entire body and even on the inner organs of the body. So if we have a stomach ache, we feel pain in the stomach. That's part of the body faculty. If we have a headache, we feel the head, pain in the head. So we have these 5 physical sense faculties. And then there's a variety of other types of material phenomena derived from the primary elements. Okay, and as I said, the most important aspect of the material form aggregate is this physical body with its sense faculties, because that is what serves as the basis for experience. But according to the Buddha's teaching, the mental aggregates are not just chemical or biological byproducts of matter, but the mental factors are just as real as the material phenomena. And each one has its own nature. And so the first of the mental aggregates is the aggregate of feeling. And by feeling here, the Pali word is Vedana. It doesn't mean what we call emotions in English, but rather by Vedana is meant, I would call this the felt tone of an experience. So that every experience, according to the Buddha's teaching, has a particular felt tone. And so there are 3 primary felt tones. So the first of these tones is pleasant. So certain experiences, we experience them as pleasant, as agreeable, as delightful. So this is pleasant feeling. And so I see a friend that I haven't seen after a long time. Along with that perception, a pleasant feeling arises. If I'm really thirsty and somebody gives me, on a hot day, and somebody gives me a nice refreshing drink, then I take a drink of it, and it's pleasant, nice taste. And so then, along with the drink, taking the drink, I get a pleasant feeling coming through the tongue. If I feel something smooth, like this cover, again, there'll be a pleasant bodily feeling. So there's pleasant feeling is one aspect, one felt tone of experience. And what is the other aspect? Yeah, but the opposite of pleasant. Okay, so there's pleasant tone, painful feeling. Okay, so This afternoon I came into the dining hall and there was an avocado on my table. I saw a squirrel had come in and eaten part of the avocado. So when I see that and I like avocado, then a painful feeling arises, disagreeable feeling. Or I'm shaving and I cut myself, painful feeling arises through the body. Or somebody gives me some kind of preparation, maybe an Indian curry with a lot of hot spices and chili, and I eat it. Then on the tongue there comes painful feeling. Okay, so there's pleasant feeling, painful feeling, but then the Buddha points to a third kind of feeling that we don't often recognize, and this is what he calls neither painful nor pleasant feeling. So much of the time we're just going about our everyday activities, and somebody asks us how we're feeling or what we're feeling. We say, I'm not especially feeling anything. So I'm not in an especially pleasant mood, not in a disagreeable or painful mood, but there is a feeling taking place. This is the feeling that's neither painful nor pleasant. It's called, conveniently we call it neutral feeling. And these three kinds of feelings are said to arise through the 6 kinds of contact. That is, contact takes place through each of the 6 sense faculties. So we have 5 physical sense faculties. So contact takes place through the eye when we see forms, through the ear when we hear sounds, through the nose when we smell odors, through the tongue when we taste flavors, through the body when we have some kind of tactile sensation. And then there's also a contact that takes place internally when we are entertaining thoughts, plans, making judgments, imagining things, reflecting, deciding. All of that internal mental activity also involves a kind of contact with the content of our minds. And from that internal contact, there arises a purely mental feeling, a feeling that is not immediately and directly directed towards some external sense object. Okay, so this is the aggregate of feeling. Then the third aggregate is called the aggregate of perception. And this is analyzed into perception of the 6 kinds of objects. The perception of visible forms, the perception of sounds, odors, tastes, tactile sensations, and mental objects, internal objects. And the function of perception, one could say, is to select something in the field of awareness and sort of focus in on its distinctive features, its distinctive characteristics. And in this way, through perception, perception serves as the basis for memory. So, say I'm introduced to a person for the first time, and so I see this person, I see the face, and so even though I'm maybe not making a conscious effort to focus in on the face, but just when you meet the person, naturally you perceive the face. And so certain features of the face, stand out, and the mind focuses in on them. So maybe 6 months later, you're at a party or walking down the street, and you pass that person, and you say, "Hey, didn't we meet at such and such a place?" So how are you able to recognize that person? because perception, previously, it singled out features of that person's face. And so perception is something like putting a mark on an object as a basis for recognition. And so all the time, perception is taking place constantly. And this is helping to organize our experience into some kind of meaningful whole. So we have labels for things, designations, concepts that we apply to things. So I ask you, what is this? More loudly? Okay, I've never known a computer before. I ask you, what is this? You say, a mouse. So I have my idea of a mouse. I say, that's not a mouse. So somebody in the past, when computer devices were being invented, came up with this device, and then they needed a name for it, and so they applied the designation mouse, and now everybody is calling it mouse, and so now I hold it up. Maybe you never focused on this one before, but you see it, and so you use the designation mouse. So you use a term that you've picked up from common usage, and we apply it to this object, so we call this a mouse. And so in the same way, just like everything in our experience is sort of determined what it is through our perceptions, the scheme of concepts and ideas that we use to make sense out of our experience. Has anybody here had experience with termites? Okay, I lived in Sri Lanka for more than 20 years, and in the monastery where I stayed, we had a library. And of course there were books in the library. And one big problem we had is that every once in a while, I would go to the library to pick out a book, and when I pick out the book, I find that the pages have turned virtually to dust. And inside the book are these termites or white ants. They come up from the ground along the wall, and then they come into the back of the bookshelf, and they devour the book. Okay, so for me, that object, my perception, it's a book for reading. I don't know what the termite is thinking, but from what they're doing, I would say that they are perceiving that object as food. So in their conceptual framework, their sanya, their perception, and probably they are sending the message down the line, hey, there's a great meal up here. These books on Buddhist philosophy are delicious. But some of them are a bit difficult to digest. Okay, so you can see how perception is working one way. Okay, then if you've never eaten, let's see, durian? Anybody not eaten durian? Okay, so you take a fruit you've never eaten, so somebody serves it, you don't have any prejudgment of the taste, no pre-perception. But then you eat it, then you get a perception of it, and then you can recognize that fruit when you eat it again. You now have a label to apply to it, to the taste, and so if somebody blindfolds you and gives you a spoon of durian, then you could apply that perception, durian, to the taste of the fruit. Okay, so there's perception. Then the fourth aggregate is a kind of umbrella category for a whole bunch of mental factors. But the most important in that bunch of mental factors is the factor, so this aggregate is called in Pali sankhara. And I translate this as volitional activities. But the word sankhara means literally things, or you say activities that put things together, that construct or fabricate or create. And so the Buddhist texts identify these volitional activities primarily as volition. Volition is the will to act. It's sort of the motivations of our actions, the intentions behind our actions. And so it's said that this is among the 5 aggregates, this is the aggregate that's primarily responsible for creating karma, which I spoke about last week. So the Buddha says that it's volition that I call karma. So it's the volitions arising through the aggregate of volitional activities that motivate actions, either bodily actions, verbal actions or speech, or just thoughts, plans, projects, hopes, desires. Okay, so that is the aggregate of volitional activities. And then there's the aggregate of consciousness. So the aggregate of consciousness, the way I understand this, that it is the basic awareness that lights up the objective field through one or another of the 6 sense bases. So the 6 types of consciousness are called eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mental consciousness. And so eye consciousness, the way I understand it and interpret it to myself, it's that light of awareness that illuminates the entire visible field or visual field. And then the aggregate of perception is what singles out or focuses in on particular things within that visible field. Okay, so we could say that it's eye consciousness that lights up this whole room so that I see this whole room here. And then it's through perception that maybe I see some of the students in the back and I say, I know these people from last week. So that is perception. But consciousness is like the light in the background that illuminates. Perception that focuses in on particular things, people, objects, and distinguishes them by way of their distinctive qualities, features, characteristics. Okay, I wanted to illustrate how these 5 aggregates work together, because the way I've been explaining the 5 aggregates, you might think, sometimes you're feeling something, sometimes you're perceiving something, sometimes you're forming some intentions, sometimes you're simply aware of everything out there. But actually, the 5 aggregates are always interwoven, sort of operating together as a unison. And so they're actually inseparable, though on some occasions, one aggregate, its function would be more prominent than the others. But they are always present together. So to illustrate this with an example, suppose the telephone rings. Okay, so there is my ear faculty, that is, belongs to the aggregate of material form. And the sound also belongs to the aggregate of material form, in a sense. It's vibrations of air striking against the eardrum. So sound and the ear faculty, the aggregate of material form. Okay, if I was really involved in some, say, a writing project and I didn't want to be disturbed, then the phone rings, what kind of feeling will arise? Pleasant, painful, or neutral? Yeah. We don't think of, when hearing a sound, of a painful feeling the way you do if you get stuck by a pin, but because you're engaged and then something disturbs your concentration, so that feeling that arises, it's a painful feeling, accompanied by a mood of annoyance. Okay, then of course comes the perception. You identify phone ringing. Then comes the volitional activity. You can either answer the phone, or you can think, just let it ring until it stops ringing. So there comes some kind of decision, choice, volition. And then, of course, there is the awareness of all of this, because the consciousness has arisen based on the ear. Okay, if I was bored, or some friend had sent me an email saying that I'll call you at 4 o'clock, and then a friend I hadn't seen in a long time, and then 4 o'clock comes and the phone rings, again, sound and ear faculty, the aggregate of material form. Perception is the same, perception of the phone ringing. Ear consciousness is the same, opening up that field of sound to awareness. But now the feeling will be pleasant feeling, and then the volition, in this case, without any ambiguity, I want to answer the phone. So you could see how the 5 aggregates work together. Okay, now when the Buddha speaks about understanding the nature of the 5 aggregates, this means to understand them in terms of the 3 characteristics. These are called the 3 universal characteristics, or the 3 characteristics of all conditioned things. So the first of these is impermanence. And this is sometimes stated that all conditioned things are impermanent, that everything that arises from causes and conditions is bound to pass away, that there's nothing everlasting, stable, permanent. But whatever arises from conditions is dependent on those conditions. And then when the conditions that maintain it in existence come to an end, that will fall away. So we could see this clearly at the macro level. We could see that, okay, if some months ago, somebody sent me a photograph of myself when I was 22, 23 years old. So if you look at that picture, I sent it to some of my friends and said, this is a picture of me when I was 24 or something like that. And they, interestingly, one said, I could see you in that picture. But another said, I'd never be able to guess that's you. So you could see the way our bodies are always changing. Now, I don't have much hair, but if it grew out, it would be gray beard. Now these young monks have black hair. If they were to grow their whiskers, black beards. But in time that's going to change to gray. So our bodies come into being at birth. They gradually get bigger, stronger, healthier, more vigorous. Then they decay. They become frail, eventually pass away. But the same principle of impermanence applies to things like, where is the Roman Empire now? Gone. Where is the Byzantine Empire? Gone. Where is the Ottoman Empire? Gone. Where is the British Empire? Is it completely gone, or? I think it's gone, yeah. Okay, so even empires pass away, and we might think that this earth is stable, but even if we survive the affliction of climate change, but sometime in the future, this earth, the solar system, is going to come to an end, and even this Milky Way will come to an end. So everything is impermanent. But the Buddha speaks of impermanence at the very subtlest level. Like those are, we call macro examples of impermanence. But the Buddha says that impermanence applies especially to the five aggregates, from moment to moment. So what we take to be bodily form, this body, I say that this body is stable and solid. But when we look up closely, sort of using the sharp vision of meditative insight to look into the body, we see that the body is actually like a current of material processes, material events that are always just arising and passing away from moment to moment. So there's nothing sort of stable, there's no stable matter in the body. But what we call matter is a flow or process of particular kind of energy, material energy. This is very similar to, like, scientists look into even to the so-called subatomic atoms. They find the atoms are made up of subatomic particles, and the subatomic particles are just electrical charges, always changing. Okay, so the body is impermanent in that it's always material phenomena, always arising and passing away. And similarly, the mental phenomena, when we look closely at our feelings, we see that they are also always arising and passing. So, for example, if you're sitting in meditation and then you get a pain in the leg, it seems, I have such a persistent pain. It's just so stubborn, so persistent. But what we find when you pay close attention to the pain, say in the leg, that it turns into a series or sequence of moments of pain. And you see that it's just like one moment of pain, then another moment, another moment, another moment. And so in this way, one is seeing the impermanence of the feelings. So any feeling, if you just examine it, you see it's a sequence of moments of feeling. And then every perception, again, arises and passes. Every volition or act of intention or emotion arises and passes. And even consciousness, the Buddha says, is just a flow or sequence of moments of being conscious, acts of consciousness. Okay, so this is the characteristic of impermanence. Then the second characteristic of the five aggregates is, in Pali, it's dukkha, which is what the word that's translated as suffering. So if you say that the five aggregates are all suffering, that is misleading, because it doesn't mean that the five aggregates themselves are always undergoing pain and misery and dejection. But what it means is that if one clings to anything in the five aggregates, clings to them and takes them to be solid, stable, and lasting, one is one is going to meet with disappointment. Because everything in the five aggregates is impermanent. And so when one clings to them, then one will meet, when they change, then one will meet with misery. And so that's why we use, for dukkha, I prefer to use here the rendering unsatisfactory. So it's not able to bring stable, permanent happiness and peace and joy if one clings to them. Because when one clings, one is sort of setting oneself up for disappointment when the things one clings to change. Okay, then the third characteristic, this is the subtlest of all and most difficult to understand. This is called anatta, which is what we translate as not self. And so to understand why the five aggregates are said to be not self, we have to understand what is meant by this word self, sort of what lies implicit in the idea of self. When we use the word self and take something to be myself, we're thinking that there's something sort of at the center of my being, the heart of my being, that's permanent, that's independent, that's always remaining the same. So when I see some forms, that there's some self hidden in the background there that is perceiving the forms. When I'm hearing some sounds, some self that is hearing the sound. When I'm thinking some thoughts, some kind of self within that's thinking those thoughts. But according to the Buddha's teaching, that notion of the inner self, that's the lasting subject of experience, that is the delusion that has to be penetrated. What exists are these five aggregates working together. And because these five aggregates are, you could say, infected with ignorance and with craving, they give rise to this delusion of I, me, and mine, or to the philosophical idea, this is myself. And so the task of insight, according to the Buddha, is to examine our experience very, very closely, to examine it thoroughly, to put it under a microscope, so to speak, the microscope of insight, and to see that what is actually occurring are these five aggregates. There's a beautiful example of this in the sutta that I attached to the file sent out, I think, this morning. It's the discourse on the lump of foam. So the Buddha, at that time, he was living with the monks alongside the river Ganges. And he says that suppose the river Ganges was carrying along a great lump of foam, and then someone with good eyesight would inspect that lump of foam, seeking there must be something solid there. But he examines it closely, he looks into it, maybe he takes a stick and hits it and it falls apart, and he sees that the lump of foam is hollow, insubstantial, it's empty. And so he says, take this material form, and then you examine it and inspect it, and it appears void, hollow, insubstantial. Then feeling is compared to bubbles on the surface of a water when it's raining. The bubbles come up and burst, nothing remains. But the bubbles keep on arising, one after another. That's like feeling. Perception is like, you know, when you're driving on a hot, sunny day on a road, a flat road, it looks just ahead like there's a pool of water, but it's a dry day. And so when you get to that so-called pool of water, it disappears, it's gone. It's just an illusion. So perception is like this. It creates appearance of a solid, substantial world, but when you look into it, perception itself is empty of any kind of substance. Then the volitional formations is compared to the trunk of a banana tree. So if somebody comes who wants hard wood, and he sees a banana tree and thinks, I can use that banana trunk to get hard wood. So he cuts it down, and then he starts taking apart the coils of the banana trunk, and all he finds are coil within coil within coil. Or it's just like taking an onion apart. So there's no solid core, but just I call it the skin, what do you call those things? The parts of the onion. And then consciousness, he compares to the illusion created by a magician at a crossroads. So to a person, I guess the Indian magicians were very skillful. So they said that they can take sticks and rocks, recite the mantra, and then a little palace will appear where there were the sticks and rocks. Of course, he puts a curtain in front of it while he's reciting the mantra, pulls the curtain away, and there's a palace. But if you look into that illusion, if you look into that magical display, it turns out to be hollow, empty, insubstantial, just the trick by the magician. And so consciousness is like that. Okay, so just to wrap up, the role or the function of the three characteristics in the Buddha's teaching. So, in fact, I already touched on this. So it's these diluted ideas about permanence, some kind of stable happiness in the five aggregates, by clinging to the five aggregates, and the clinging to the idea of a personal self, that is what leads to our suffering and dissatisfaction. And so correct insight into the three characteristics, that is the way to remove the clinging, to remove the distorted ideas, and then that brings inner freedom and ultimate liberation.
Now, let's turn to a bit of Buddhist music. It is very interesting. Here it is, Buddhang Saranang Gacchami by Wayfarers.
other refuge do I seek, and no other will there be. The Buddha, Dhamma, and Sangha are my only refuge.
Well, Buddhang Saranang Gacchami. I am sure that you like it. It was indeed good and I enjoyed it. And our last item is by Venerable Sawati Dhammika, a prolific writer who talks about his path to a spiritual life. An amazing recollection of his recent past. Here is Venerable Sawati Dhammika.
By the time I was 20, I had joined a Buddhist society, and very fortunately the society that I had joined in New South Wales, in Sydney, the president of that society was very learned in Buddhism, and I sort of hit it off very well with her. She was much older, she was a grandmother, but she'd been interested in Buddhism since the 1950s. And a big difference between her and many other Buddhists in Australia at that time was she read and knew the Tipitaka very well. And she encouraged me from the very beginning. She said, after you've read a few books about Buddhism, why don't you read the words of the Buddha himself? And that sounded like a good idea to me. So she encouraged me from the very beginning to read the suttas. And that advice of hers has stayed with me ever since. And I'm very grateful for that guidance that she gave me, because I think it has held me in good stead. So I joined a Buddhist society, then I started reading the suttas. I think at that time, if I remember correctly, one of the first Buddhist monks came to Australia, Venerable Kantipalo. He was an English monk who'd been ordained and lived in Thailand for 15 or 20 years. And I sort of hung around him for a while and that, and eventually I decided I wanted to become a monk. Now, I think this was another manifestation of my maybe something dreamy, unrealistic, romantic character. Nonetheless, that's what I decided to do. So I had a job for a short period of time and I had enough money, and in 1973 I left Australia with the distinct purpose of becoming a Buddhist monk. I didn't know anybody who was a monk. I didn't know where I was going to go or who I was going to meet or anything like that. And I arrived in Singapore in about October, sometime in October 73. And I'd already read all about Singapore, and I'd read that the biggest temple in Singapore was the Temple of the Thousand Lights, or the Thousand Lights Temple, something like that. And so I figured out on a map where it was. I arrived in Singapore. When I woke up in the morning, I went straight to that temple, and I was filled with trepidation and expectation. Wow, a Buddhist temple. I walked in, and in front of me was the ugliest Buddha statue I have ever seen. It was just horrible. It had a great big nose like a beak, and the skin was all yellow. And there were pigeons nesting on his head, and there were big long streaks of pigeon's poo coming down. I mean, it was, oh goodness me, it was a real letdown. Anyway, I went up to the temple, to the Buddha statue, and I bowed, and just then a monk came out with a mop, and he started mopping the floor. And I thought, wow, You're a real Buddhist monk. So I went up and bowed to him, and he just sort of said, yes, 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 donation box. So this was my first experience of Buddhism, and it wasn't a particularly inspiring one. Anyway, a few days later, I made my way to KL. I can't remember what I did there. And then I made my way to Penang. And I went to a large Buddhist temple there. It's a huge Thai temple with a big reclining Buddha statue in it. And I'd have to tell you that I didn't find it particularly inspiring either. There was a monk there basically collecting red packets. Anyway, I bowed and I looked around, and it was nothing. But then a young man came up to me and we talked, and he said he was a Buddhist, and I said, this is not a very inspiring place. And he said, well, he went to a particular temple which I might like to visit. So I said, yeah. He took me to Mahindaram, and as we entered the gate, I saw a tree. And I said, is that a Bodhi tree? He said, yeah. I said, wow. I was really filled with awe. Wow, a real Bodhi tree. And I went and had a look at it, and I picked a Bodhi tree leaf up. And that was the first Bodhi tree leaf I'd ever seen. And I kept it for years. It seemed, I felt like I was gradually getting a little nearer Buddhism. Anyway, we went to the temple, and I met the chief monk called Premaratna. And he seemed to be a kindly man, and I explained to him, I've decided to come to Thailand to become a monk. And he was very, very helpful. He said, well, if you're going to become a monk, you have to learn the ceremony, the chanting and what have you. So he gave me a book and encouraged me to try to learn it. And I stayed there for about 5 days, I think it was. So each afternoon I would go to him, and he'd tell me if I got the pronunciation right. And so that was my beginning of learning the ordination ceremony. And once again, I remember him with great fondness many, many years later, because he took time to help a complete stranger who had a vision and an ideal. Anyway, during the day, this other young man, I can't remember his name, we went and visited the big Chinese temple up on Penang Hill and some other places. I thought Penang was such a lovely, quiet, sleepy town in those days. So after that, I went over to Butterworth and took the train to Bangkok. On the train up there, the person sitting next to me was about 40 years old. He was a Thai, and he spoke some English. And like travellers do, you know, where are you from, what are you doing? And I mentioned to him that I had come to Thailand with the intention of becoming a monk. And he told me that he'd been a monk for more than 20 years. Wow, I was really impressed. And he told me that he had disrobed recently because he was deeply concerned about the political situation in Thailand at that time, particularly the presence of the American Army and the American Air Force in Thailand. And it became clear to me that he was quite very involved in this. Anyway, it took, I can't remember how long, but in the time I met him and we talked and we got to Bangkok, we sort of became friends. I mean, the Thais are personable and friendly people. And he said to me, why don't you stay with me and I'll introduce you to some of my monk friends. Wow, that was terrific.
Well, that's all for tonight, and I hope you learned something from this program. We ask you to stick to these weekly programs, and I'm sure you will benefit from these programs. Thank you for watching the Buddha Dhamma TV. May you all be well, and I'll see you tomorrow at the same time. Namo Buddhaya.